Okay, next up is the Alpha Trooper. All the screws have been removed, so let's get started. I noticed Alpha Troopers like to stick at the tip here, so be careful when you're opening your shell. There haven't been too many problems with the Alpha Trooper because the kit installation is relatively straightforward. There aren't any special locks that aren't familiar, nothing fancy like the Raider. So some tips with the Alpha Trooper. The biggest problem is the spring tension being too high, causing the bolt sled to twist during a prime. A tip for that is to fill in this area here with epoxy, or hot glue may work, but a glue that dries hard is the best, and it prevents the priming handle of the bar from moving back and forth, and it gives you a longer priming handle to work with, so it doesn't flex out of the way and then you can't prime back far enough to engage the trigger lock or the trigger catch. Another thing, this where the priming handle connects to the foregrip, fill this in with epoxy putty or clear epoxy or hot glue, anything to keep that in place, and it will also prevent the plastic from warping there, giving you a longer prime, giving you enough distance to engage the trigger catch. Besides that, there really isn't much to do with the Alpha Trooper. Make sure all of these springs, like the dart tooth spring, the magazine spring, and the trigger connector springs are in place and not poking out. There have been some cases where the spring has been rubbing on the inside of the trigger catch. That may have been from an earlier batch of springs. Well, that's what I suspect, where the coils were wider and they can rub here. You can sand or Dremel that a little bit to give it some clearance, but these cases have been few and far between, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. To install the trigger catch, you just drop it into place underneath the plunger tube. Make sure this connector bar is in front of the bolt sled, or you won't be able to fire or prime. The best tip for installing the kits on the blasters with this back cap is to install it with your stock spring first. That would be the spring that came with your blaster. And take your trigger catch spring and seat that down. And while you're putting the two halves of the shell together, to prevent the trigger catch spring from shooting off, and you'll never find it again, trust me, just take your thumb and push down on the spring, and that holds everything in place. And take your shell and push it together. And on the shells, if the bottom of the shell doesn't go together, just engage your magazine release. It's usually the case. It's usually because the two halves of the magazine release aren't interlocking correctly. So just engage that release and your shells should fall right together. Then work in the spring and put on your back cap. With the Alpha Trooper, make sure the back plate, if you choose to use it, is centered and not off to one side, because it will scrape on your plunger. That goes for any of the blasters using this back plate. Just install it like that. And to test the prime, because the bolt sled has the tendency to warp, either screw it together in this area or squeeze really hard right there to simulate having the screws in. And then take the back cap and place it on the table or against yourself or whatever. Apply pressure to keep the bolt sled in place and test it out. be careful that your spring doesn't do this. I don't know if you can see that, where the end of the coil has been tucked under the next coil. So, like that. You do not want your spring to get tangled like that. There we go. Very smooth. And don't want to dry fire. The air restrictors have been removed on this, so I'm going to jam a dart down in there. Alright. Then after you've confirmed that everything is functioning properly, including this backplate, you can go ahead and work out your stock spring, install the new 6 kilogram spring, quite a bit more power. And test the prime, squeeze, hold on your back plate. There we go. It is, with all of these blasters, it's going to be much more difficult to prime them. You know, roughly 2.5 times more difficult due to the spring tension. And there's no way around that. Just be extra careful not to dry fire. And with the new O-ring, actually Alpha Troopers didn't really need a new O-ring, but you know, if you improve your seal, the dart, if you want to avoid dry firing, you stick a dart in there, you can see the suction seal. Just like that. It gives you a lot of range.